All right. Well, I know you are not anxious to see me up here again, and normally I would have a board member or another staff member moderate this time, but I actually know our next speaker a little bit, Ari Fleischer.
A little.
Well,
More than a little.
yeah. So we once worked together, all too briefly, I might add, on a Elizabeth Dole for President campaign. That was 1999. You can Google that. It did happen. It ended somewhat abruptly, and I then took a job with Steve Forbes for president. And when Forbes dropped out of that race, I took a job at the Renewable Fuels Association, thinking it would be a nice place to spend a year before I got back into politics. And, well, here I am. Now, Ari, he took a different path. He left the Elizabeth Dole campaign and became press secretary for the George W. Bush campaign. Ever heard of that guy? So anyway, he ended up at the White House. I ended up at RFA. Clearly, I made the better decision. But so 25 years ago, he was there. He's now as a Fox News contributor and has kept his eye on D.C. From inside the White House and now the outside looking in. And so we're just really excited to have Ari join us today, reminisce a little bit about what it's like, maybe some behind-the-scenes stories, but also we want to answer all of your questions about what's going on today. So get out that QR code. I got a handful to get us started, but start loading up that QR code. So as I mentioned in my remarks, 25 years ago, Ari was with President Bush when they learned of the horrific September 11th attack. There was an anthrax attack after that. Obviously, we then had two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. And not to mention domestic policy. So you had a very busy time, a very crowded hour at the White House.
Thank you for reminding me of those difficult days.
I know. Now, I would like to say that Ari and I have remained friends during all of this time, but when I asked him for the good friend discount off of his speaker's fee, his response was I should try a little harder to raise the funds. So thank you to the sponsors who helped me with that. So with that, Ari, welcome. Let's give Ari a round of applause. So I'm going to jump into a few questions that I have, but we do want you guys to use the QR codes and start loading those in. So many Iowans, we should do a show of hands, have actually met presidents or future presidents thanks to the world-famous Iowa caucuses. But few of us, I think, in this room, if any, have ever worked day in and day out with a president. So what was it like with George W. Bush as a boss?
He was a fantastic boss. Just in terms of being a person, the man was fun, lively, kind of a towel snapper. He held you accountable. He was very demanding, great sense of humor. But, one of the criticisms the press used to give Monty was that the staff was loyal. We were loyal to President Bush, as if that was somehow misguided. But I'm going to tell you a story about loyalty with President Bush. And as any of you know in your businesses, you don't get loyalty. You have to earn it. People won't give it to you unless you deserve it. So one day at the briefing, my instructions for President Bush were always to look forward, never blame anything on our predecessors, and Bush's predecessor was Bill Clinton. So I had to bite my tongue a lot to not blame things on our predecessor. But one day at the briefing, I got asked a question, and I won't get into all the details of it, but I blamed Clinton. And the question was about violence in the Middle East and the Second Intifada in the West Bank. And I pointed out that the Second Intifada began when President Clinton was in office, not when President Bush was in office, which was accurate. And then the questioner went on. The questioner wanted to blame it all on Bush. So because I did acknowledge and say that it began on October 2000 when President Clinton was in office, AP wrote a headline. And the headline was, Bush blames Middle East violence on Clinton.
Of course they wrote that headline.
So as soon as the briefing was over, the story hits, and I'm in my office, and I get a call from Condi's office, Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, saying Condi wants to see you. So I go over to see Condi. She says, did you blame the Middle East violence on President Clinton? I went, no, I didn't say that. She said, well, how do you explain this AP headline? So I went, well, that's not exactly what I said. And then she said, you need to apologize and take back your remarks. And I said to Condi, no, I don't. She said, yes, you do. I said, no, I don't. She said, yes, you do. We went around that for a minute, and I realized maybe I better, because I knew President Bush wouldn't be happy with what I said. So I marched myself into the Oval Office. I turned myself into the president. He said, you better clean it up. So I issued a retraction. I had to put out a public statement taking back what I said, blaming Middle East violence on President Clinton. Well, that became the lead story in the news, of course. The lead story on all the network news back then when people watched the network news. And it was a very embarrassing day. You know, Fleischer retracts statement, and I kind of got a little bit of a pounding. So rough day at the office, very rough day at the office. It happened to be the next morning I had a previously scheduled speech. I would have normally accompanied President Bush to an event he was doing. And when the president walks out of the Oval Office, Monty, and goes on to Marine One, there's a protocol. The protocol is the president leaves the Oval first. He walks about 20, 30 feet in front of the staff. We trail behind him, so we're not in the camera picture. He goes in the front door of Marine One. We go in the back door of Marine One. And that's it. Well, I got word later that day when I got back to the White House that President Bush was looking for me to walk shoulder to shoulder with him from the Oval Office onto Marine One. He knew I had a bad day. He knew it was tough and embarrassing for me to take back what I said. But he wanted the world to know I was his guy. And that was the kind of leader he was and just character he has.
That's cool. Now I got to undo that. That's really cool. All right, we want some more behind the scenes stuff, but I want to go back. I have to do a little nostalgia. I'm sorry. Before the White House, you transitioned from the Dole campaign to the Bush campaign. So I'm just curious. You know, you're the national press secretary for Elizabeth Dole one day, and in a matter of, I don't think it was very long, a few days, maybe it was weeks, I don't remember. You were the national press secretary for the Bush campaign. Or that, I don't know the exact titles, but more or less. So how did you end up on the Bush campaign?
Well, it's interesting. I had never met George W. Bush in my life. And then it was August of '99. It was the Iowa straw poll. So I'm out here with Elizabeth Dole, and I'm backstage with her. And then she goes on stage to give her speech. George W. Bush comes off stage because she followed him the way the lineup worked. So Bush is walking off stage. I'm just standing back there by myself. And he sees me, and he turns. And he comes right up to me, puts his arm around me like this, as he wants to do, looks me right in the eyes and says, I like the way you do your job, and walked off. I was like, wow, he knows who I am. I mean, this guy's going to be the nominee. I mean, it's pretty obvious at that point. And I thought, that is really, really nice of him. And I never thought anything further about it. Went back to work, and Elizabeth Dole came in a third place in the straw polls.
Strong third place.
Strong third place, thanks to Monty. And it was kind of a boost for us. So back to work for Elizabeth. And then when she dropped out, the Bush campaign made a full court press to get me to move to Austin. So Governor Bush called the congressman I worked for, who was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee prior to my working for Dole. Karen Hughes, Bush's communications director, called me. Other people who I knew on the campaign called me and said, you got to move to Austin, got to move to Austin. So I flew down to Austin to have an interview with Governor Bush. And I just loved the guy. I mean, we hit it off, and they made an offer to me. I had two other great offers in the private sector, and I just decided I've got one more in me.
One shot.
One more presidential run. You know, it didn't work out with Dole. You're sort of burned out. You're tired. But I said, I've got one more. So I moved to Texas and became a spokesman.
All right, that's cool. So, I mean, some of you know my first career was politics, as you kind of surmise. So, yeah, I think I'd take that shot too. I just didn't choose as wisely. But I had my reasons. It worked out.
You got paid more than I did working for Forbes. Certain that's true.
It was also a short-term gig, though, as it turned out. So this is something I'm just genuinely curious about, because I never got to do this. You went to the Bush campaign. Bush is elected, not just the nominee, but ultimately elected. What was it like to walk into the White House for the first time? I've been there a couple times as a tourist, you know, or maybe for a meeting. But what was it like to walk into the White House for the first time as someone who actually worked there?
It was heady. It was really something. And you try not to get heady because you've got a serious job, but you better stop and soak it in because it's rare. And you know you're fortunate to be able to be there. You know, I remember when Bush secured the nomination after we lost New Hampshire to John McCain, got into a pitched battle with John McCain, Bush becomes the nominee. And that was in March of 2000. And when you become the nominee, all of a sudden, you get Secret Service protection. And I remember the day the Secret Service swooped in. Now, he's not the president, he's just a nominee. So it's not the huge army, but it's a pretty darn big army. And I got a little hard pin, a Secret Service pin that could allow me to go up to Governor Bush anytime, anywhere, past every Secret Service agent. I was thinking, isn't that cool? And then, first day at the White House. And I remember I had a old Saab convertible. And I drove it up. And at that time, there were 2 gigantic blast-proof barriers to the White House. Now there are 3 as the perimeter is pushed farther and farther back. But I drove up to the first one, and my Saab was cleared to go in. Bomb-sniffing dog came out, inspected my car, go through the second one, and I literally parked right next to the West Wing, right next to the Situation Room. I was one of the top staffers, so I got to park right there. And I walked into the West Wing, past a Marine, who opened the door to the West Wing. Through the West Wing lobby, I took a left turn. The Roosevelt Room was on my right, and my office, the Office of Press Secretary, is right there on my left. And my desk sat literally 30 feet from the front door of the Oval Office on one side of me and 30 feet from the podium in the briefing room on the other side of me.
It's pretty cool.
And I just couldn't wait to dig in and start to do that job.
Now, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but for some of you who have some gray hair like me, there's this big kerfluffle, as only DC press can do, where you guys came in on the first day, and the story went out that all of the W's, because it was big about, to differentiate that Bush from the previous Bush, it was George W. Bush, all the W's had been removed from the keyboards of the computers in the White House, old executive office building, whatever. Is that true?
Yes, it is. On many of the keyboards. Yeah, there were a lot of young people who worked for President Clinton, and especially Vice President Gore, who, of course, Bush v. Gore, who weren't happy. And they didn't want to leave that building. Well, they had to. And so they did a little mischief, a few pranks. But again, my directions from President Bush were don't look back, don't blame Clinton. But the press loved that story. They were demanding more details, and somebody on our staff leaked it to somebody. And so it was out there that this actually happened. And so I'm on now. The White House press secretary, by the way, is the last person to ever leak anything. Because I'm the first person to stand at a podium on camera and get asked everything on the record. So it's not supposed to be discussed. I won't discuss it. If it's supposed to be, I'm the one who discusses it. So it leaked. And now I'm on the record, cameras are rolling, mindful that it's true, it all happened, but President Bush doesn't want me to talk about it. So what do I do? So I got asked a question, what did I think about the W's being removed? And I just was trying to balance my competing demands. And I just remember I just said, well, my reaction would have been wow, but the W's were missing, so it's just oh.
Well played. And being able to do that on your feet is why Ari was probably noticed by President Bush before, when you were still working for Elizabeth Dole, and went on to be what I think a lot of people consider to be one of the best modern day press secretaries that were there, as far as I'm concerned. You got my vote. And I'd say that even if you weren't sitting here, although this makes it easier. Now, I do want folks to know that I do want to discuss this next topic with Ari. I was in D.C. at the time. My wife and I drove up I-395 every day to work, and where it bends past the Pentagon. And I know you'd probably just soon skip it. And it is emotional for a lot of us, but you did agree to share some insights, and so thank you for that. But this, one of the reasons we chose Ari, well, we knew him. He'd been out of the White House long enough, his speaker fee came down to where we could afford it, and I'm teasing. But this September will be the 25th anniversary of 9/11. And it just makes me think about my kids and how many people out there don't have that personal memory. Like, where were you? For me as a kid, it was when the Challenger exploded. Or, for some people, it might have been when JFK was shot, for my dad or whatever. And so I I do want to touch on that. So you were traveling with the president. He was outside of D.C., but you were with him. And I believe he was reading a book to a children's class, if I remember right. And the news came in. We have many leaders in this audience. And I hope, obviously, nothing like that ever happens that you have to deal with. But could you share how some of those key decisions, I mean, you have to make instantaneous decisions on how you're going to handle this. I mean, everything from do I get up and leave to do I finish this event, let alone the big world, future impacting decisions. Can you just talk a little bit about maybe how some of those key decisions were made that day?
Yeah, the thing that penetrated or hit me most deeply, watching it all unfold before my very eyes, and I kind of glued myself to the president's body that day and took notes on everything he did and said. I spent much of the day in his cabin on Air Force One. I was in the schoolroom when Andy Card walked in and whispered in the president's right ear, a plane hit the second tower, America is under attack. I was some 15 feet over the president's left shoulder, leaning against a wall. And what struck me, and again, I offer the similarity to anything that any of you do as leaders, whether it's in a factory, a plant, anybody who is responsible for the welfare and concern of other people. When calamity hits, what I noticed that day, from the president himself to the Secret Service, the military aide who carried the nuclear football, the infrastructure around the president, and with one exception, the entire senior White House staff that travels with the president, everybody was like this. Nobody was emotional, except one person. And that one person lost all faith from the president. Everybody was on the most emotional day you can imagine for our country and for those who were suffering, lost lives, wondered where their loved ones were. Everybody was steely. And that's the only way to be when there's a crisis. If you're emotional, if you are high, if you go low, if you're high, low, you're not going to inspire people to follow you. You'll be rickety. And nobody wants to follow somebody like that. I think anybody here who's ex-military, or you know that sense, law enforcement, you've got to have that steady, calm demeanor. And that's what is the most jarring thing to me, Monty, that when I look back on how fraught that day was, and to this day, how people are suffering from it, unemotional was how everybody around the president was and how the president was.
I mean, there's a camera on him when that whisper goes into his ear, and
Sure, there was a camera on him that very moment, but for most of the day when there was no camera on him,
yeah.
he was that same demeanor. The most frustrated part he got that day was, and this is amazing, the phones on board Air Force One, down to the PIOC, the Presidential Emergency Operating Center, which is the bunker underneath the White House, which is built just for a crisis like this. The phones kept cutting out. He'd be on the phone with Condi Rice. He'd be on the phone with Vice President Cheney. And one of the most famous pictures of that day taken by the White House photographer was the president standing there with one hand on the hip and one hand holding the phone out like that. Kind of the way, you would if you're going, hello, hello. The phone's cut out. And we didn't even have satellite TV on Air Force One in 2001. It barely existed anywhere.
People forget all the technology we didn't have back then.
That's right. And so we would get video as we flew over ground-based antenna that were sufficiently high up that Air Force One could pick up the transmission, and then it would peter out until we could pick it up again flying over the next location. The technology broke down, things didn't work, communication was bad. But I want to follow it up with one other thing. 3 days later was the most tough emotional day I had. And that's when I accompanied the president after a memorial service at the National Cathedral, where when I heard the Battle Hymn of the Republic play, it sent a chill down my spine. To hear that familiar song in that famous cathedral, where you just knew that song now meant we're going to war. And we went to New York, and after going on the pile at Ground Zero, where there were still service dogs sniffing to see if there were survivors, dogs with pads on their paws who would go right back in again. Found no survivors. We went to the Jacob Javits Center. We're meeting with some 100 relatives of those who were missing 3 days after the attack. Every single one of them believing that their loved one would come out alive, and none did. And that's the other side of this, the emotions, the importance of our government from the president on down being in touch with the people of this country to recognize suffering. And President Bush was so good at listening to those families. All they wanted to do was talk about their loved one. And he would ask, tell me about him. Tell me about her. What were they like? What was their favorite sport? What did they do? Did they have children? Just letting people talk about the people they loved, who they were hopeful could be found.
So
that's the other part of this. We have the best military in the world. We have tough leaders when we need them, I hope. But we also have that sentiment, and that was driven home to me at the Jacob Javits Center that day.
And I want to get to a couple of, at least in my memory, iconic moments. But before I do, most of you out there know that I prefer to laugh rather than cry. And so sometimes I use humor to deflect a tense or somber situation. So I have a memory of 9/11 that, not that day, but now years later, I can look back on and kind of have almost a smile. And that is, you knew him, of course. I think he worked for you. I had a friend named Scott Stansel. And he was in the White House that day. And then he told later that day or a couple days, whenever we were able to get back in touch with each other, he talked about how when word of the plane that ended up crashing in Pennsylvania, they didn't know it was headed to D.C. They didn't know if it was the Capitol or the White House at that time. They think it was the Capitol now. But anyway, so he said the Secret Service came in and just basically screamed, "Run as far away from here as you can get." And he's in his suit and in his dress shoes, and he was a runner. He was a runner. He was a good runner. And he said a personal best mile running in wingtips because it was pretty scary stuff.
Yeah.
But
they
do you have any
take
moment
off your heels and run.
Do you have any memories that brought a smile? Not then, obviously, but looking back, was there any moment, a moment of warmth or anything that warms your heart or brings a smile?
It goes back to what I was talking about at the Jacob Javits Center. One of the people the president met with, I believe her name was Arlene Dillon. Her son was a detective, and he was missing. They later found him dead. She gave the president his shield and wanted him to have it to remember those who rushed in to save other people's lives. And he kept that shield with him. I'm sure he still has it. I need to ask him that. And he brought it when he addressed the nation on September 20th from Congress and gave a speech to the joint session of Congress. That's the speech where he said that if you harbor a terrorist, you are a terrorist. He took out that shield and he showed it to everybody. He says he will always carry it and remember. That touched me, because just a mom to do that, to give up her son's shield in service to the president and the country, therefore, it just showed me, for all the strife, for all the polarization we are indeed going through now, what a loving, wonderful people we are as Americans. How deeply people are patriotic and love this country as we should love this country. And I saw it that day. And so that's the uplifting piece of it. It was the unity that instantly brought us together.
Speaking of bringing together, I have two more questions, and we're going to pivot a little bit to more current affairs, as
Yes.
well as I'll hit the tab that lets me see your questions, which I hope you're
And
putting.
by the way, ask hard questions. Ask whatever's on your mind. None of this fluff stuff that Monty is doing. I want hard, tough questions.
Yeah, you don't work for the White House anymore. You can say anything you want. So there were two moments that stuck out to me. First was when Bush went up on that pile and grabbed the megaphone and spoke from ground zero. No prepared remarks, no teleprompters. Maybe speechifying wasn't the strongest. He wasn't bad, but maybe it wasn't his best. No Winston Churchill in that regard, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But his remarks there just really resonated, I think. How were you with him that day? What did you see from your perspective?
Yeah, that was September 14th. That was in the
Okay, yeah,
pile.
I'm going to say it was still smoldering. It was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, Monty. I mean, President occasionally struggles with the English language.
Strategery. Oh, wait, that was
Strategery.
actually Saturday Night Live. Never mind.
No, that was Bush.
Was it?
Saturday Night
I
Live
still use
copied
that
it from
word.
Bush.
Ask my staff. I love that word.
And then we took pride in the fact that that was the official word, strategery. But it's his gut. And that's what you want in a leader. You want somebody in an untested moment that you can read their gut and say, what will they do? And that was the most spontaneous, unplanned moment you could imagine. And that firefighter, Bob Beckwith, who was standing with him up on, that was a burnt out fire truck that the two of them were standing on. And Beckwith he was up there, and then when the president decided, I want to talk, and I need a megaphone, people started to scour, where can we go, where's the appropriate spot? They saw it was a little elevated, so they said, we'll go up here. So the president starts to go up there, and Bob, the firefighter, starts to come down. Bush said, no, you stay right here. Totally spontaneous. It's his connection to people. And then he put his arm around Bob Beckwith, kind of the way he put his arm around me in Iowa. And all from the heart, all from the gut. And when the audience couldn't hear him, those firefighters, as Bush would put it, the most testosterone-filled group of people you'll ever meet, standing in that pile, searching through the wreckage, working nonstop. These people were putting in 18-hour shifts, and they couldn't hear him. And they're shouting at him, we can't hear you. And it just, you may not be able to hear me, but the people who did this will hear from all of us soon. And the crowd roared. They heard that. And it just struck the right chord that our country needed to hear. There was another one, Monty, where he went to the Pentagon, I think on September 12th, and he said, when he was asked about who did this and what's going to happen to them, and he said, there's a poster out west, in the old Wild West, who said, wanted, dead or alive. And that's how I feel about who did this. And he later said, Mrs. Bush told him, don't talk like that. What are you going to do, Bushy? You going to go get him? You going to go get him? But I always thought it was the right thing to say. It was his gut, it was his heart, and it is what he did to pursue the people who did this to us. And I think we all want that in an American leader.
Well, one last question here. Ari and I share another thing in common. We're both New York Yankees fans. Now, hold the booze. Because there was a day where I think all Americans were rooting for a guy wearing a Yankee jacket, and that was, and I don't remember how long after this was it because they shut down sports? Was it the first game after when they decided to start replaying sports? I can't remember, but the president went out to Yankee Stadium, New York City, to throw out the first pitch. And I don't know why, but that just seemed like a very pivotal moment. And I can't imagine, I'd have trouble hitting you'd practice and then you'd get out there around all these people and you'd throw it about halfway between the pitcher's mound and the catcher. You throw it 10 feet to the side, and he threw a strike. Yeah. I was like, hey, sign him up. He's better than some of the pitching I'd seen that year for the Yankees. But can you talk about just that? Maybe if there's any behind-the-scenes stories. Yeah. But I don't know if anyone remembers that, but he got out there and with literally the eyes of the world on him threw a strike. That's pretty impressive.
Especially since he hates the Yankees. Remember, he's the owner of the Rangers.
Yep.
And he does. He's not a Yankee fan.
The damn Yankees.
But he was determined to go to the Bronx to throw out that pitch. He could have gone out. The first game was in Arizona. Okay. First two games were in Arizona, the Yankees against the Diamondbacks. And he said, no. I'll throw out a World Series pitch, but we're going to do it in New York.
Okay, that's right.
I'm going to go there to show this nation that New York is back, that this country is back. So my job, actually, I used to play baseball. I still play. I play in a 55 and up hardball league where I live, a wooden bat league. So I warmed President Bush up before he throws these pitches. So actually, first pitch he ever threw at a game was in Milwaukee when Miller Park opened up. The Brewers had a new field. And I went on the south lawn and warmed the president up. And I remember he threw a few short hops that scooted past me on the south lawn, and I went jogging down the south lawn and found it in a pack of flowers and started playing catch again with President Bush. He goes to Milwaukee and throws the pitch straight in the dirt in front of home plate. Javier Lopez was the catcher. He picked it up on a short hop and said, "Perfect strike, Mr. President."
It's good to be president.
So Bush remembered that. He remembered that he bounced the ball. So he goes up to Yankee Stadium, and underneath the first base stands at the Yankee Stadium, behind the Yankee dugout, is an indoor bullpen. So Bush is warming up to throw out that pitch, and he's got to wear a bulletproof jacket on and all that stuff. So he's warming up in front of the mound. He wasn't going to take the rubber, which is 60 feet, 6 inches away. You throw from in front of the mound. It's like 50 feet. It's an easier throw, closer to the plate. You can't really bounce it if you got an arm. Derek Jeter sees him warming up from in front of the mound, the great Yankee shortstop. And Jeter says, "Mr. President, are you going to throw from in front of the mound?" And Bush says, "Yeah, I think I will." Jeter goes, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Why not?
The new White House presidential advisor, Derek Jeter, ladies and gentlemen.
And Jeter says, "This is New York. If you throw from in front of the mound, they're going to boo you." So Bush is thinking now, I bounced it the last time I took the rubber. I don't want to get booed here, especially after September 11th, Bronx. So he said, "All right, you think they'll boo me? All right, I'll take the rubber." So now Bush is determined. He goes back up to the rubber. He's working on his pitch from the rubber. Then he goes out to the dugout right before he takes the field, right before he's announced. And the last thing he hears is Derek Jeter in his ear saying, "Don't bounce it, Mr. President. They'll boo you."
So he was having a good time with this.
Jeter was having the time of his life working the president. By the way, there was one other thing on that field that day. How many umpires are there at a World Series game? 6. You have the normal 4, and you got one down the left field line, one down the right field line. That day there were 7. One of the Secret Service agents got dressed up as an umpire so he could be as close to the president as possible. Yeah, you can find this. It's online. There's somebody did a video of it too. It's fabulous. You get to watch this guy in the umpire room, taking off his suit, taking off his Secret Service gear, putting on umpire stuff, putting back on his gun and all his other gear, and then putting the umpire jacket over all of it. 7 umpires before that pitch was thrown.
I did not know that. Now I saw some questions have come in, but please send some more. A couple of them I think will be set up by this question here. So we again, a long time ago, longer than we probably care to admit, both worked for Elizabeth Dole. And it does seem like the world has changed a bit. And quite frankly, it seems like our country has changed a bit. Even our political parties, I would argue, have changed quite a bit. You've had a front row seat in D.C. for the last 25 plus years. Kind of what's your take on what's going on?
2 political parties have swapped bases, to put it short. When Ronald Reagan was president, Republicans regularly won the suburbs, they regularly won college-educated voters, and they regularly won people who made more than $100,000 a year. Since Reagan, that started to come down, and the number of people who were blue-collar, working people who didn't make as much and weren't college-educated started rising for Republicans. But it was slow. When George Bush was president, we barely won the suburbs in 2004. I think we won them by 2 points. We barely won college-educated voters. I think we won them by 2 points. We barely won people who made more than $100,000 a year. But the Republican Party, the establishment Republican Party, that was the party. It really was establishment, and then you had what would have been called back then a right-wing fringe. It was essentially a country club, highly educated party. Democrats were the party of unions and working people. The trend started to cross during the Bush years into the Obama years, when college-educated voters were pro-Obama. Working class people were increasingly Republican. President Trump is the one who drove it home. I mean, look at how Iowa voted in terms of rural vote. President Obama used to win the rural vote. So the parties have now changed base. Under President Trump, the Republican Party is mostly a party of people with high school degrees, working people. The one group that Kamala Harris did better in 2024 in losing than Joe Biden did in 2020 in winning. Harris went backwards in virtually every demographic group. Hispanics, African Americans increasingly voted Republican, increasingly voted for Donald Trump. You know what the one group was where Harris did better? People making more than $100,000 a year. So the Democrats are now the college-educated party of upper-income voters. Republicans are much more the blue-collar, scrappy, working-class party. Massive change, Monty, from how when you and I started out in politics, from the Reagan, the George H.W. Bush to the George W. Bush years. And it explains a lot. It explains so much. It's partly also why the press can't stand Donald Trump, because they're all college educated, and they have a real hard time. Their newsrooms don't have many or any blue-collar, working-class people who never got a college degree, especially at the elite newspapers. Monty and I were talking last night, in the Dole campaign in 2000, or the Bush campaign in 2000, if there was a front-page story in the New York Times, it mattered. It reverberated. It influenced voters. It influenced reporters. Today, if there is a front-page story critical of Republicans or President Trump on the front page of the New York Times, no one who is for Donald Trump cares.
Doesn't move the needle.
Doesn't move the needle, doesn't change the electorate, doesn't change anything. It gives people more reason to hate Donald Trump if you're inclined to hate Donald Trump. But for the rest of America, it's just more noise. And that's the biggest difference to me as a communications person, how the media breakdown has occurred.
So you brought up media communications. Question from the audience. Do you agree with how the current administration is managing the press? I think we can all agree there is a different style, actually both parties. I mean, Biden's team would shout and yell while he was leaving a room, so they could, I mean, it was kind of crazy. And in Trump's 2 terms, I think they've taken a different approach to media relations than perhaps back in the past. You can comment on that. So
Perhaps.
So do you agree that with how the Trump administration handles the press?
I absolutely do. In fact, I would go further. I wrote an op-ed as President-elect was coming into the office, saying that there is no reason for those 49 coveted seats in the White House briefing room to go to the mainstream media. Why should they get the front rows? Why should the front row be NBC, ABC, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post? In an era now where people get their news from so many diverse sources, why are they the dominant people in that briefing room? That briefing room is physically set up. It is the last bastion of the 80s when the mainstream media was all you got. It still is essentially set up that way. Now, Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, has brought in new media, and she seats them on the right in some special seats that are against the wall. But I would have jumbled up the whole room. I would have moved the New York Times to the middle or the back. They still should have seats. Absolutely, they still have a voice, and they should be able to ask whatever questions they want. That comes with the territory if you're the White House. But they shouldn't be the dominant or the only voices in that room. So I would have put these new media and these new conservative outlets, from the Federalist to the Daily Signal, Washington Examiner, into the front rows and let their voice ask different types of questions. And particularly when you look at the mainstream media's failure to cover President Biden accurately, it is one of the saddest stories of my time. I knew the press was liberal when I had to deal with them. They were always liberal my entire working career. But at least back then, they said their job was to be fair and neutral. They don't even consider being fair and neutral anymore. The New York Times, its entire economic model is based on electronic subscriptions, online subscriptions. And they know the demographics of those people are all liberal. Very, very few conservatives read the New York Times. I still subscribe to it because I just want to read it occasionally, not often. But that is a profound change, and I salute this White House for recognizing that so much of what they write appeals to one side of the equation and not to all the American people, and they fight against it.
I want to ask all my questions, but Lisa, who puts this all together for us, said she'd kill me if I did. So you just mentioned how the press covered Biden. So I'm going to go to an audience question. Who do you think, and I think it's kind of like maybe asking about the job they did and what they did, but the specific question is, who did you think the key advisors to President Biden were in the last year of his term? I don't want to infer what they're inferring, what they might be thinking behind that question, but, the media covered him a certain way, but you had to have a White House staff.
Yeah, his number one advisor was Jill Biden. I mean, it was his wife. I think what she said was extremely influential to him. And I want to be polite because that's my nature, But there is no question that he was in decline. And the press looked the other way. And so it's a very legitimate question. Did he remember a lot of the things he did? And one of the things that frustrated me about the press corps is why didn't they ask him obvious questions to test his memory? Instead of just saying, Republicans accuse him of cognitive decline, yet he looks vigorous, said his press secretary. That's how they'd cover it. They had all kinds of opportunities, the few times, I should say, that he did allow the press to ask questions. When he was called into the special counsel who said he wouldn't prosecute because Biden was an elderly, forgetful man who couldn't remember details about when his son passed away.
Oh man, he took some heat. He was the only one being honest.
But why didn't the press just say to him, sir, do you remember the year your son passed away? I mean, they could have just asked the questions to find out. Sir, do you remember, were you ever briefed that it would have been smarter to leave 7,500 troops behind in Afghanistan? Which General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified to Congress. He did say that to President Biden about the Afghanistan withdrawal. President Biden publicly said nobody told him that he had an option to leave troops behind. Why don't they ask the questions to test his memory so we, the people, can see how he's doing? They just gave him a pass. So I am very worried about who he was advising, what he remembered, what he forgot. And then, of course, he had that disastrous debate, which knocked him out of the race because he couldn't speak articulately.
So we talked a little bit about Biden. I think there's probably some people here who love Donald Trump. I think there's probably some people here who are triggered by him. So I recently saw a clip. I don't know if you've seen this. You should Google it. It's pretty funny. Of Bill Maher handing Steve Bannon a copy of the Constitution. Bannon had come on his show, where Bannon was making the case that Trump will not only run for a third term, but will win and will be sworn in. And so Maher pulls out a copy of the Constitution and says, can you read this sentence here? And anyway, what's your takes on all the chatter by some of the people in the Trump? I don't know if they're close, I don't know if they're fringe, but people who it seems to bubble up this notion that Trump's going to run for a third term. What's your take on that?
First of all, this actually is a heartfelt, serious matter to a lot of Democrats I know. I went to a wacky liberal arts liberal college in Vermont, and I was at an alumni event in New York City a couple months ago. And the first question to a professor of constitutional law from this college, the very first question from the audience was, tell me President Trump cannot serve a third term. It was hard. I mean, this person was almost trembling asking it. So I take this actually as something meaningful and real for people who don't like President Trump. And the only advice I can give you, please, he loves to torture people. Relax. It won't happen. And what you have to realize, when I talked earlier about how we should love this country, one of the things to love about this country, our Constitution is stronger than any individual in our system, including the President of the United States. And we should take tremendous pride in that. I hope he safely serves out his second term, but then on January 20th, 2029, we're going to have a new president. And that is the way our system is designed. It is the way it will work. Don't let him troll you.
And I want to ask you some questions about these upcoming elections and get your insight. But I honestly didn't have this on my bingo card, which explains to you that I am completely out of touch with America, apparently, because about half the questions I'm looking at here have the word Epstein in them. So I'll just pick one, and for those of you who asked a slightly different question, sorry, I'm not going to ask 12. Any thoughts on the impact of Epstein evidence pulling in former presidents into the spotlight, from Clinton and Obama to obviously Trump? What's the end game of all this?
Well, there's President Trump.
Can good come out of this?
President Trump and President Clinton have both been called into this spotlight. But what does that mean? Yes, questions have arisen, but if the issue is that either let's start with Trump. Did President Trump have inappropriate relations with a minor? We already know the answer to that is no. Virginia Giuffre, one of the witnesses who went after Jeffrey Epstein, she publicly said, no, Trump, I never saw Trump. Trump had nothing to do with this. Virginia Maxwell, Epstein's associate, accomplice, said the same thing. So there's no evidence that Donald Trump did anything wrong. Did he know Epstein? Yeah, he knew Epstein. They got into a fight, and apparently then President Trump didn't like Epstein. He used to like him. President Clinton's another matter. I mean, the pictures that have come out about with President Clinton, you physically see pictures of a young woman on President Clinton's lap on an airplane, on a private airplane. We don't know yet about President Clinton. But the broader question is, what's to be done today? And as far as I'm concerned, if there's any evidence that anybody anywhere did anything wrong with a minor, we should go after him. You can't do that. So if there's evidence, prosecute the person. There might be a statute of limitations question. I'm not a lawyer. But go after them if you have the proof, if you have the evidence, and if the woman, the victim, is willing to speak and testify, which many women don't want to do. Many women just, they went through it, they suffered, and the last thing they want to do is relive it. So it's not as easy to just say prosecute. You need the victim to want to prosecute. But all for the rest of it, all the emails that are coming out and names of people, you know, people did hang out with him. Should they be embarrassed? Should they be prosecuted? You know, if they knew, they should sure be embarrassed. So I think that's where it is. What the political side of this, I'm seeing a lot of very conservative Republicans really lose their faith in President Trump on this because they want people prosecuted. And they think that there's some type of powerful government cover-up going on.
There's actually a question about that, but I've got a couple others I'd like to get to first, because I do want to get to some political questions. This is an audience question, who do you view as the most effective leaders in Washington today, and what do you think are the qualities that make you have that judgment?
Well, there's no question in my mind, it's President Trump. Whether you like him or don't like him, that man has expanded the power of the executive branch and has carried out actions that many previous presidents talked about but would never deliver on. Now, he does it like a bull in the china shop. And everywhere he goes, he brings another china shop with him. So his manner, his style, I'll give you one example. I used to regularly sit on meetings with President Bush and European leaders where President Bush would cajole them diplomatically, but Bush was somewhat of a tough guy who spoke vernacular. Bush would cajole them to increase their spending on NATO. And he said to them, I remember in one meeting, I think it was with the president of France or Germany, he said, if you keep spending the way you're spending, you're going to eat Russian lead. And that was the way Bush was saying, you know, Russia's going to attack you. And they would just ignore it. They said, yes, George, I understand. Oui, I understand. You know, we have these deficits and we have social welfare programs that we cannot afford already. And it's very, very hard, but we are trying. He would get the same polite brushback for 24 years. President Clinton, for 8 years, politely urged NATO increase spending. President Bush for 8 polite years. President Obama for 8 polite years. 24 years, NATO learned they could run around us. We don't mean business. We just keep spending on our national defense to help them out, but they won't do it themselves. In comes Trump. Pure bluster. Shoves people aside at photo ops, demands they pay their bills. You're falling behind on your payments. You need to pay or we won't defend you. Rude as can be. They're doing it. So this is the ultimate Trump story. Do you want more of the same politeness, diplomacy, American tact that we've been known for without any effect, without them listening? Trump got it done. Now, I will say when it came to Greenland, I scratched my head at the whole Greenland thing. I mean, everything he actually accomplished by getting permission to basically beef up our bases, put new bases down there, do it forever, I think he could have gotten all of that without rustling any feathers.
Yeah.
I just don't know why he didn't go in. You know, there was time that England under King Henry VIII wanted to take over Scotland, and they called it the rough wooing of Scotland. King Henry VIII offered his daughter to marry the Scottish princess or queen at the time, and it was called the rough wooing. When Scotland wouldn't go along with the marriage, he sent in the army. A little rough, less woo. For Trump in Greenland, I would have done a lot more woo and a lot less rough. And I think he'd have come out the exact same place. But he's a bull in a china shop.
So I do want to get to a couple.
Second person I got to say is Marco Rubio. Rubio has been tremendously effective and direct-spoken and blunt. I've really enjoyed seeing this Marco Rubio.
And he's taken on a lot of jobs. In fact, I heard the IRFA board was thinking about offering him my job, so I got a little nervous. But okay, so let's do a couple political, and then I'll go back to some audience questions. Assuming Bill Maher was right, and not Steve Bannon, the race for the presidency in 2028, it will be open on both sides.
Yeah.
Republicans will start in Iowa with our First in the Nation caucuses. The Democrats are still trying to figure out whether they'll start here or somewhere else. Unfortunately for them, because I think they get better candidates when they start here. But I suppose if you don't want the Democrats to win, you could argue it's a good thing. But anyway, the Democrats probably won't start here, but they'll start somewhere. So, let's right now all these way too early, top 25 college football polls are coming out for next year. So what is your way too early handicapping of the presidential contest that we will start to see, quite frankly, we'll start to see people come in and campaign on behalf of Iowa candidates just because they like them, not because they want to get their name out for the Iowa caucuses or anything like that. So what do you think, what's your take? Who's out there?
Well, actually, the College Football Playoff Selection Committee is a client of mine. I attend all their meetings, and we do not use or look at any preseason polls. In fact, we don't even have our first meeting until about 6, 7 weeks into the season, so people have to prove what they got before we even rank you. I offer that same thought about politics. All this
that would be
noise
boring,
now,
so what do you think?
Monty, I'm like you. I'm somebody who's done it from the inside, and we got to test them. We got to see on both sides what they got. I'm a capitalist. I'm a consumer, and I do that in politics too. Make them come to us and show us what they got. And
Will there be a wide field?
It's going to be wide open on both sides.
Okay.
I don't believe there's a front runner on the Republican side today. A lot of people say it's J.D. Vance just by virtue of the fact that he's the vice president, but he hasn't proved anything about himself yet to the voters. He's got to take that step. Even if President Trump, and I don't think President Trump's going to endorse anybody because he's going to let it play. That's his style. And then he's going to endorse whoever the front runner is and say, I made them the front runner. So I think you're going to have Rubio, you're going to have Vance, you're going to have Ted Cruz, who of course did defeat Donald Trump in the Iowa primary, Iowa caucus.
We don't like to remember that.
No, Ted does.
Move on.
I've talked to Ted about it. He remembers it fondly.
I'll remind him of his op-ed he wrote about how much he loved ethanol while he was here too.
That's true too.
It's on my bulletin board behind my desk every day.
And then you're going to have a couple of Republican governors, congressmen, same thing on the Democrat side. So what I'm going to look for is, of course, who's raising the money, but the money is not primary. You can have a lot of money and lose, Steve Forbes.
I say, if you're pointing to me, that wasn't my problem.
But the biggest factor is going to be how's the economy and how's President Trump's job approval rating when you get to 2028, 27 and 28. If President Trump is riding high, it's going to obviously empower J.D. Vance, the MAGA wing of the party. If not, if the economy is weak, it's going to be a problem. So it's grounded in the reality of the economy and the president's job approval, but it's going to be wide open on the Republican side. And Iowa, as always, will play a huge, crucial role in thinning the herd on the Republican side.
And it's not just going to be, we don't have much time, so very briefly, it's not just going to be Gavin Newsom or somebody that just storms out of the gate?
Same process on the Democrat side, totally wide open.
Okay. All right, well, Iowa, you have for those of you from Iowa, you guys have your work cut out for you to whittle this down. So when Trump was here, I wanted the same question, but for Congress. When Trump was here last week, he was reminding Iowans of some of the things that obviously he thought they would like that he had done. And he kept saying, remember us in the midterms. Don't forget about this in the midterms. He's clearly thinking a lot about the midterms. So just any outlook on that? I mean, a lot of people just from historic trends assume the Democrats will take over the House, maybe the Senate. Will Trump be impeached? Tell us all about, what's your take on the midterms?
I think it's highly likely that the Democrats will take the House. I think it's unlikely that the Democrats will take the Senate. They might gain a seat, Republicans can gain a seat in the Senate too. In 2018, in President Trump's first midterm, Republicans lost 40 in the House, picked up 2 in the Senate. So the Senate's very different just by virtue of which races, which states are up and which are not up. But here's the problem Republicans have. In the recent presidential election, roughly 150 million Americans voted. In the most recent midterm election, 100 million Americans voted. A 33% drop-off. Huge drop-off. And who is dropping off? Mostly Republicans. Democrats hate Trump and will show up in huge numbers to defeat Trump, including in special elections in Texas, in gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia in off-year elections. Republicans don't love Republicans as much as Democrats hate Trump. Hence the drop in Republican turnout. Republicans love Trump when Trump is on the ballot. 150 million people voted, a massive surge in voting.
There's a group of people that turn out when he's on the ballot but haven't turned out when he's not.
That's my point.
Yeah.
150
But
million.
he turns out all the Democrats.
50 million, but the Democrats are still turning out no matter what. So my advice to the president, I say this regularly on Fox, is he needs to nationalize the election in the sense of bringing people to the polls, not taking over state elections, but bringing people to the polls. For Republicans, this is your chance, if you're a Republican, to make your down payment. This is your final down payment on keeping the White House. If you don't show up in the off year to make your down payment, it won't matter what you do in 2028 because the House will go Democrat. They will find something to impeach Trump again, and we're going to be right back into that same soup of nonstop fighting and division. And I'd rather have unified government and get something done.
So I'm not exactly sure what time it is. I see the countdown clock going, but I'm going to ignore it. We used to only have an hour break for lunch, and this year we have an hour and a half. So if you're hungry, you can leave, but I'm enjoying this too much. I'm not letting, Ari's going to earn all of that speaker's fee before we get out of here. Sorry, I'm just teasing.
I was about to leave.
Yeah, you can ignore that. We're going overtime. You like sports. So here's kind of something that's interesting. I mean, and I think this, quite frankly, you could almost say this went back to Bush with signing statements. Like, I'm signing this bill, but I'm going to ignore this part of it. Sorry, that happened. Obama started doing it. Republicans flipped their lid when he was doing executive orders for things that really aren't really what historically you might have thought they were for. Trump took it to the next level. Biden took it to the next level. Trump took it to the next level. So the question here from the audience is, how do we pivot to make Congress more effective again so that and then it says, and walk back some of the executive branch orders. And I think that's a fair question because in my view, presidents are doing this because Congress isn't acting. I mean, Congress has created a vacuum that they're filling.
Exactly.
I might argue somewhat uncomfortably within our constitutional framework, but it's Congress that needs to do their job. Well, okay, that was an editorial comment. So what's your take on this?
A powerful chief executive will take power under the rules of our system if Congress doesn't exercise its power. It's a vacuum, it's a void. So the problem Republicans have when you have a 2-vote majority in the House of Representatives and you have such a bitterly split Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, and then you have a 60-vote requirement in the Senate to get anything done, it's a formula for gridlock and inaction. If there's gridlock and inaction, it's easier for the president to take action. That's why I believe in much more of a unified government. I don't want the Democrats personally to take power, but I would rather be in a system where the Democrats have the House, the Senate, and the White House. Let's see what they do, and if the people don't like it, then we throw them out. But gridlock, to me, inaction, getting nothing done, is really a formula for malaise. I think it's one of the reasons that people have lost their faith in government. And I want people to have faith in government. I believe my party and my ideas are the best ideas, but I can't say we're the only ones with good ideas. So when the Democrats get in, like they did under President Biden, let's see what they got. And if we don't like it, throw them out. And that's exactly what happened. That's the way our democracy should work. But if you really want a powerful legislature, you are not going to get one with a 2-vote majority, either for the Democrats or the Republicans. You're not going to get it with a filibuster. And that's fraught if you eliminate the filibuster. But if you want Congress to enact laws, you have to have bigger margins and you can't have a filibuster.
Ooh, I kind of scared of what would happen without the filibuster. I hate it when I don't like, when it's against me, and I love it when it helps me.
My solution on the filibuster is to eliminate it, but you eliminate it where the effective date begins with the next Congress. So no one party can immediately manipulate it to get an advantage right now. Fair is fair. You don't know who's going to control the Senate after the next election. So if it's effective then, you're eliminating it because it's the right thing to do to eliminate it regardless of who comes into power.
There's so many good questions.
It's fair, but that's not a word that people use in Washington.
Yeah, so many I can't get to. I apologize for those of you I haven't got to. But you
I'll
said,
stay as
you
long
said,
as you
send,
need.
you said send tough questions. All right. Is there a deep state, a swamp, or both?
What a good question. You know, as somebody who worked at a time when I believed from the inside that this government was really good, and especially after September 11th, fighting a war against terrorists who would try to kill us if they could, I didn't see a deep state. I saw people who were devoted to the protection and love of this country. That was my experience. I do think it's fair to say things have changed. I do think it's fair to say, and this was true, I saw elements of this, but it was muted because the biggest issues were protecting our country from another terrorist attack. But I remember leaks coming from the Environmental Protection Agency, all designed to make George W. Bush look bad. No matter what he did, we had an internal problem with the EPA. And that's because it was 95% Democrat staffers who had a permanent view of what the bureaucracy should be and a permanent view of what right and wrong policies are. And they preferred Democratic presidents, and if there was a Republican president, they'd work from the inside to get bad stories written. And I've come to believe that that extends throughout every agency in the government. I was talking with the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, Harmeet Dillon, under President Trump, and half her staff wouldn't go along with the things she was telling them to do. They just refused. So half her staff is gone. The federal government, particularly being located in the District of Columbia, Northern Virginia, and Southern Maryland, overwhelmingly liberal, college-educated, better-off areas. The federal government is staffed overwhelmingly by people in the bureaucracies who have a liberal agenda. And I do think that's problematic. Although there are, of course, many people who are fair, who are just want to do their job from a technical point of view, it's really not the case in particularly the most sensitive, important issues.
I think it's
And so that's whether you call it a deep state or a swamp, call it whatever you want. There's a real ideological issue in the bureaucracies, and that matters.
I mean, I feel like even our friendships have become polarized and tribalized, and I think that's over in the. So we're going to do two more questions, and I'll play off of a little bit of what you just said about how it's in there. So, maybe the solution is to get some of the agencies out there. I mean, USDA would fit nicely in Des Moines, Iowa, I think, but that's just me. Maybe I'd rather have EPA here where I could keep an eye on them. I don't know. but I'm going to take a couple of questions here from the audience and more from together. Was there an idea that you came across, so it could be when you were in the White House, it could be since then, where you're like, man, I wish that would have happened. That would have been a good policy. Is there something like that? And it could be a policy or it could be a government reform. Is there something from your years of observing our government where you're like, man, I wish I had a magic wand and that would have made a difference?
What an interesting question.
This
will sound old, but immigration reform.
Oh, good. That checks off another question.
The failure of Democrats and Republicans to come up with what our policy should be, compounded with the open border that allowed 10 million people to enter America illegally, which in my opinion, entering America illegally is in itself a crime. It is. It is a civil crime. And I'm a first-generation American. My mother came to this wonderful country. She fled the Nazis. We have reason to believe she came across, and she left July of 1939 from France. She's Hungarian. Crossed the borders, got to France, and sailed on the last ship that crossed the Atlantic Ocean before the German U-boats started sinking every ship that moved. She got to New York City in August of 1939. World War II began September 1st, 1939, with the Nazi invasion of Poland. My mother literally had to flee the Nazis and leave everything behind, her family, everything behind in Hungary, including most of her relatives, almost all of whom were killed, to come to this great country. I believe that immigrants make America a better, stronger, richer, best country on earth. Because people who come to this country from other countries, so long as they assimilate and become Americans and learn English, they enrich us, and we are better. But you have to come here legally. So what do we do with the people who've been here 20, 30, 40 years who came here illegally? This is where Congress has to step in. The ICE raids in Minnesota. Who should we be targeting? Up to what point? If Congress doesn't speak, then the only answer law enforcement can provide is if we encounter somebody who came to America illegally, what do we do? Let them stay? We're law enforcement. We just encountered somebody that should not have happened. They should not have been let into America. So that's where we are. So the issue would be immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform. It's not going to happen.
I feel like both parties
that's why we are where we
would
are.
rather milk the issue politically than solve it sometimes. I hate to be cynical, but sometimes
Well, it's just a reflection of the polarization, how our districts are set up, so there's very few purple seats left. They're deep red and deep blue, and they hear from their constituents.
So we're going to end on hopefully a upbeat note. What was your favorite day at the White House?
My favorite day. All right, this is
softball.
This actually goes back to what we were talking about with President Bush and that pitch. So after President Bush threw the pitch, that was Game 3. Yankees won Game 3, but they lost Game 7. So the Arizona Diamondbacks won the World Series, and part of winning the World Series is you get to come to the White House. Well, I am such a New York Yankees fan, I refused to announce that the Arizona Diamondbacks were coming to the White House for their World Series honor. So every Friday, I would do what's called the week ahead. And I'd take the podium and I'd say, on Monday next week, the president has a meeting with the president of France. On Tuesday, he has a cabinet meeting. Then it came Wednesday, the day the Diamondbacks were coming. And I sat down on one of those seats on the side. I refused to announce they were coming. My deputy took the podium. He announced on Wednesday, the world champion Arizona Diamondbacks are coming. Then we switched places. I continued. On Thursday, the president meeting with congressional leaders, blah, blah, blah. On principle, I could not announce that they were coming. So flash forward now to the following Wednesday. I'm just finishing my briefing. Briefing's over. Senior wire reporter says thank you, which back in those days when the senior wire reporter says thank you, I'm Pavlovian. I'd get up and I'd leave the briefing room instantly about hearing the word thank you. I still do that to this day. Somebody says thank you, I get up and I leave, whatever I'm in the middle of. So I start leaving. So I start to leave. And around the corner comes this guy in a suit and heading up to my podium. I'm like, who are you and what are you doing? And right behind him was a 6'10" guy in a suit. And I went, it's the two Arizona Diamondback pitchers who beat the Yankees, Curt Schilling and Randy Johnson.
They were brutal.
So I retreat back to the podium, and I realize not a single reporter got up from their seat. This whole thing has been set up. The cameras are still rolling. And I go back to the podium. Randy Johnson looks down at me, and he hands me a Diamondback hat, rubs my bald head, and says, I understand if I rub your head, it's good luck, and we'll be back next year. And all I could think of is Joe Torre, the Yankee manager, might be watching. I said, no, you won't. The Yankees will. And I got roasted on live TV for being a Yankee fan of the Diamondback. So that night, I'm sitting in my office, 6 o'clock at night. I have 4 TVs in the office. Back then, all 4 were set to Fox News. And I changed all 4 TVs to ESPN. And I watched myself, and I made SportsCenter that night. And that was my highest, best, favorite day at the White House, making SportsCenter.
All right, let's hear it for Ari. I do want to say thank you for being here. If that triggers you to walk off, that's good. Just real briefly, we have 2 awesome panels and a great Seth Meyer, the just recent former USDA chief economist, so we can ask him all the questions and he can answer them without restraint. I don't want to say honestly like he wouldn't before, but without restraint. So come back here, 1:30 sharp. 1:30 sharp right here for lunch. If you're lucky enough to have be an IRFA member and you have some little hashtags on your name tag, that gets you the IRFA member lunch across the hallway. For the rest of you, there are restaurants around, but there's also a buffet, or not a buffet, but anyway, there's some sort of very affordable, very good lunch down back by where registration was. And so you can go there, be right back here at 1:30. Once again, a big round of applause for Ari Fleischer.